My brother was a monster, but now I don't know what he's become, and it terrifies me. I don't know exactly when I realized my family was so unfair. Maybe it was on my 12th birthday, or maybe it was when Jake was born. That's how I'd start telling anyone who's willing to listen about my childhood. And trust me, I've had to tell this story way too many times. It's not like I want to sound bitter, but the truth was pretty clear. Being the firstborn didn't mean much around here. My parents? Well, they're an odd mix. My dad, David, is strict but weak. He doesn't have the guts to stand up to my mom, Lisa. And Lisa? She's got this overprotective, suffocating love for my little brother, Jake. He has high-functioning autism, but honestly, there's nothing about him that makes him special. He's just like any other kid, except he got everything handed to him on a silver platter. I'm Ethan, the firstborn. But that didn't seem to count for much. Everything I had, Jake had to have too. If I was playing with something, Jake would throw a tantrum, scream, cry, and wreck the place until he got his hands on it. If Jake got something new, oh, he'd rub it in my face like I didn't matter. But it wasn't just about the toys. It was everything. I remember the first time it really hit me, my 12th birthday. I was stoked. I'd been talking about getting a Nintendo 3DS for months. The hype was real. I could already picture myself in front of the TV, the console in my hands, living the dream. When I finally opened it up, I almost screamed in excitement. But that feeling didn't last long. The moment my mom saw me with it, she looked at me and said, "Ethan, you need to share with Jake. If you don't give it to him when he wants, I'll take it back." I was stunned, like, how could she say that? I just got the thing and she was already handing it over to Jake? So I gritted my teeth and tried to play it cool. I figured maybe I'd get a few hours before Jake came running in, demanding it. But nope. The moment I started playing, he screamed, "I want to play too." And before I could say a word, Mom grabbed the 3DS from my hands and gave it to Jake. Jake, the kid who had no idea how to take care of anything, dropped it on the floor or threw it around like it was just another toy. But I couldn't do a damn thing about it. The straw that broke the camel's back came a few days later. I was playing, totally into the game, when Mom just snatched the 3DS from my hands without a second thought and gave it to Jake. I could feel the blood boiling in my veins, but I kept quiet. Then, something unexpected happened. Aunt Rachel came over, and she saw the whole thing. She'd never seen how bad it was. And when she did, she snapped. She turned to my parents, her face red with anger. "Do you guys even realize what you're doing? This is Ethan's birthday present. How can you just take it from him like that?" My mom and dad stammered, trying to justify it. "But Jake will be so upset if he doesn't get it." Aunt Rachel shot back. "So every time Jake wants something, you give it to him no matter how unfair it is to Ethan?" That's when it clicked. The point of no return. Mom reluctantly handed me the 3DS back, but a few days later, she bought Jake his own. Jake was grinning from ear to ear, while I just stood there, feeling the weight of it all. In that moment, I realized there's no such thing as fairness in this house. And the worst part, it didn't stop there. Every birthday party, every special moment, it was all about Jake. He couldn't handle it when someone else was the center of attention. I remember one birthday, my own, when I was supposed to blow out my candles. Guess what? My parents told me to let Jake do it. I fought them on that one. Hell no, it was my day. But the real kicker? Jake, being the spoiled brat that he was, spat on my birthday cake because he didn't get to blow out the candles. It was the most disgusting thing I'd ever seen, but thank God Aunt Rachel stepped in before he ruined it. That was the moment I knew things were never going to change. I could never have predicted what happened next. It was one of those moments where everything just crashed down at once, and I was left standing there, completely helpless. A week before my 14th birthday, Mom and Dad sat me down in the living room, and I knew something was up. They looked unusually serious. I could tell right away, something was off. "Your birthday's coming up," Mom began, her tone calm, almost too calm. "But we're not having a party this year." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. But there wasn't one. She kept going like it was the most natural thing in the world. "We don't want Jake to feel left out or upset," Dad added, shrugging like it was no big deal. My brain froze. "What? You're canceling my party?" Mom just nodded. We'll still get you a gift and a cake, but no party. It's for Jake's sake. You understand, right? I felt like I'd been slapped in the face. I opened my mouth to argue, but Dad just gave me this look, like he didn't care. It's just easier this way, Ethan, he said. That was it. No explanation, no real care. Just a cold, heartless decision to erase my birthday, all because of Jake. I tried to protest, to make them see how unfair it was, but my words just fell on deaf ears. My family was blind to the fact that I existed. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing. I was furious, but also desperate for someone, anyone, to hear my side of the story. I had to do something, and I had to do it big. So I did. The next day, I went to school, and during lunch, I told my friends what had happened. At first, they didn't believe me. They thought I was just venting, exaggerating. But when they realized I was serious, their faces dropped. Wait, your parents seriously canceled your birthday for Jake? One of them asked, eyes wide. I wasn't done yet. I went to my teacher, Mr. Harris, and told him the full story. Then I went to my school counselor, Ms. Adams. I was shaking with anger, but I didn't care. They needed to hear me. I needed them to understand that I wasn't crazy. By the end of the day, the story was everywhere. My friends were texting their parents and teachers were talking. The news spread like wildfire. Soon, it hit social media. People were outraged. They couldn't believe a parent would cancel their own kid's birthday party for the sake of a younger sibling. There was a storm of messages, comments, and posts, all of them asking the same question. What the hell are they thinking? Even some of my parents' friends got involved, calling them out. People who had always sided with my mom and dad were suddenly asking, how could you do that to Ethan? The backlash was brutal. My parents were furious, but they couldn't stop it. My mom turned red with embarrassment when one of her friends texted her saying, "This is insane. How could you cancel Ethan's party for Jake?" I thought for sure that they'd understand the magnitude of what they'd done, but instead, they took it out on me. I was grounded. No phone, no video games, nothing. They told me I was ruining the family's reputation, like it was my fault for speaking the truth. But I didn't care. I'd already made my decision. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. The truth had to come out, no matter the consequences. Then, 2 weeks later, everything took an unexpected turn. Mom and Dad called me into the living room again. This time, their faces looked strained, like they were trying to hide something. "Ethan," my dad said, "we're going to make it right. We've decided to throw you a party at your favorite restaurant." I didn't know what to say. I mean, this was what I had wanted, right? A party, some attention, a chance to feel special for once. But as soon as I heard the words, I knew it wasn't because they cared. It wasn't because they were trying to make it up to me. It was because they were trying to save face. The party was a mess. Everything felt forced. Jake was fuming. He kept glaring at me from across the table, his face twisted in jealousy. The moment they brought out my birthday cake, Jake tried to knock it over, his little hands reaching for it in anger. But for the first time, Mom and Dad stepped in. They actually stopped him from causing a scene. It was the first time they'd ever really intervened when Jake misbehaved. And honestly, it was such a strange feeling, watching them finally take action, but only because they were trying to keep up appearances. They didn't care about my happiness. They just didn't want to look bad anymore. The party ended awkwardly. Everyone left and Jake was still fuming. He didn't say a word, but as we all got into the car, I noticed him staring at me through the rearview mirror. He wasn't crying. He wasn't throwing a fit, but his eyes were full of something that made my stomach turn. It was pure, cold hatred. And then, without any warning, he spoke, his voice low and venomous. "You'll pay for this, Ethan. You'll see." I looked back at him, my heart sinking. Jake didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat there, seething in silence. And in that moment, I knew, whatever came next, it wasn't going to be pretty. It didn't take long after my 14th birthday for things to go from bad to worse. And it was all Jake. The change in him was subtle at first, but I could feel it. The tantrums stopped. The screaming, the throwing things, it all vanished. In its place was a cold silence. And I could see it in his eyes. The familiar, whiny desperation had been replaced by something far darker, far scarier. Hatred. I don't know when it happened exactly, but one morning, I woke up to find my headphones had been completely cut. The wires were shredded, and the device was barely usable. I figured it was just an accident, but then I started noticing more things. My stuff, my clothes, my books had been tampered with. Small things, but enough to make me question what was really going on. I'd find little slashes in my shirts, not big enough to notice right away, but just enough to ruin them. My shoes would be moved around in my closet, as if someone had been looking through them. Jake had always been a brat, but this was different. This was calculated. At first, I didn't want to believe it. But after the third time my money went missing from my savings jar, I knew who was behind it. It was Jake. No question about it. I tried to talk to my parents about it. Mom, of course, just dismissed it. Maybe you misplaced it, Ethan. You know how forgetful you can be, she said, all too casually. Dad didn't even look up from his newspaper. He just sighed, barely registering my frustration. Just let it go, Ethan. You're making a big deal out of nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I had to face the truth, even if no one else would. I went to Aunt Rachel, told her everything, and to her credit, she actually believed me. She didn't sugarcoat anything. I'll talk to them, she promised, her voice sharp with anger. She did, and for once my parents couldn't ignore it. They reluctantly handed over the money, but there was something different in their eyes, something fearful. It wasn't just guilt, it was fear. They were scared of Jake, too, and it only got worse. One afternoon I came home to find the house in complete chaos. Jake had completely ransacked the place. The living room was a disaster. Books pulled from shelves, papers scattered everywhere, and the couch cushions thrown across the room. I went upstairs to my room, and that's when I saw it. My drawers had been pulled open, my things scattered and torn apart. Jake was searching for something. Something, but what? Then it clicked. He wasn't just taking things. He was looking for money. I ran downstairs, but I wasn't fast enough to stop him. Jake was in the living room, tearing up the floorboards with his bare hands, his face twisted in a desperate frenzy. My parents were just standing there, staring at him like they were watching a wild animal. They didn't try to stop him. They didn't even say a word. I tried to step in. Jake, what the hell are you doing? I shouted. He didn't even acknowledge me. He was too far gone, his mind fixated on something I couldn't see. Then, in one of the most terrifying moments I'd ever witnessed, Jake stormed into my parents' room. He locked the door behind him, and I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal. Jake, open the door, Dad shouted. But it was no use. Jake was trying to break into the safe. I tried to get in, but it took Dad slamming his shoulder against the door to finally get it open. By the time they busted in, Jake was on the floor, clutching the safe like it was his only possession in the world. He was howling, crying like a wild animal, completely out of control. Let go of it, Jake, Mom screamed. But Jake didn't stop. He didn't hear her. They finally managed to get the safe away from him, but not without a struggle. I had never seen him so feral, so unhinged. It was like he was possessed. After that, things didn't get better. They only got worse. And then, Jake's 14th birthday came around. I don't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't prepared for the explosion that followed. Mom and Dad were still under Jake's spell, still terrified of what he might do if they didn't give him exactly what he wanted. And that's exactly what happened. Jake demanded a PlayStation 5 for his birthday. The request came without warning, and for the first time ever, Mom and Dad refused. Jake, we can't afford that right now, Dad said, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. Jake didn't respond at first. He just stared at them. Then, slowly, his expression changed, like something snapped in him. Before anyone could react, Jake picked up a chair and threw it across the room. The crash was deafening. Glass shattered. The TV fell off the stand and hit the floor with a sickening thud. And that was just the beginning. Jake wasn't a little kid anymore. He wasn't a tantrum-throwing toddler. This was a storm, a force of nature. He grabbed anything he could and threw it across the room. Vases, framed pictures, bookshelves. I watched in horror as he destroyed everything in his path, not caring about the damage he was causing. He was like a hurricane, and no one could stop him. Mom was on the floor, sobbing. Dad was standing, frozen, staring at Jake like he was a complete stranger. It was like they realized, in that instant, that the child they'd raised the one they'd spoiled and enabled, wasn't a child anymore. He was a monster. I watched all of this unfold in front of me, and I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible over the chaos. They made him this way, and now they can't control him anymore. What had started as a spoiled brat had morphed into a dangerous, unpredictable force. And I didn't know how far it would go, or what the consequences would be. But one thing was clear. Whatever came next, I wasn't sure anyone could stop Jake. The tension in the house was suffocating. After Jake's outburst on his 14th birthday, the family could no longer pretend everything was fine. There was no more avoiding the inevitable. We were living in a house where every day felt like a battle, but now we were all on the brink of a collapse we couldn't stop. And then Aunt Rachel stepped in. She'd seen enough. It was clear to her that the situation had gone beyond simple dysfunction. The family was unraveling, and she wasn't going to let my parents ignore it any longer. She demanded a family intervention. For the first time in what felt like years, my parents agreed. But even then, it wasn't because they wanted to fix things. It was because they were cornered. The pressure from relatives, neighbors, and even some of their friends had gotten too loud. They knew they had to do something, or they'd lose face entirely. The intervention took place in the living room. It was surreal, like a twisted family meeting, only with no one offering support, just accusations. Aunt Rachel led it. My grandparents sat in uncomfortable silence, and some extended family members were invited to attend. It felt like a courtroom, and I was the one sitting at the witness stand. I had never spoken so frankly about everything. I told them everything. The years of being ignored, the constant feeling of being invisible. I didn't hold anything back. I talked about how Jake had stolen from me over and over again, how he'd wrecked my stuff, how he'd systematically terrorized me, all while my parents did nothing to stop it. I explained how his behavior had only escalated, how his temper had turned from tantrums to outright destruction. Jake sat there, arms crossed, his eyes full of defiance, but for the first time, no one was looking at him with pity or indulgence. He wasn't the baby of the family anymore. Aunt Rachel didn't hold back. She cut right to the heart of the matter. Jake, you've become a thief, a destroyer, and you expect everyone to keep letting you get away with it? She asked, her voice sharp. Jake's face twisted with rage. Without warning, he stood up, slamming his fist on the table. "Shut up!" he screamed. He kicked over a chair, and for a moment, I thought he was going to attack someone, but no one moved. No one reacted. We had all stopped giving him what he wanted. It was the first time I had seen him truly alone. The chaos, the noise, all of it, it was gone. Jake couldn't escape this. He couldn't shout his way out. It was as if the family had finally stopped enabling him. That night, things began to change. The consequences started. The weight of it all hit my parents, and they had no choice but to act. Jake was going to pay for his actions, at least in theory. Mom and Dad sold off everything. His PlayStation, the TV, his bike, his drone, even his clothes, the fancy, expensive stuff. Everything was gone. I watched as his room was emptied, everything packed up, every corner of his world taken from him. The walls, once lined with his stuff, were now bare. His bed was still there, but the space around it was a cold, vacant wasteland. It was the first time I had ever seen Jake completely stripped of his privileges, but he didn't react the way I thought he would. There was no screaming, no tantrum. Instead, he was just empty. His anger had dissipated, replaced by a hollow look in his eyes like he was simply waiting for the next opportunity. Mom and Dad tried to act like they had done the right thing, but I saw through it. I saw how terrified they were of what Jake would do next. They thought taking his things would teach him a lesson, but all it had done was force him into a silence that was more dangerous than anything. I knew it wasn't over. Every time I left the house, I would glance back at the window, and there he'd be, standing behind the glass, his eyes locked on mine. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't grief. It was cold, calculating, like he was plotting something. One evening, after another tense dinner with my parents, I went up to my room. As I passed Jake's room, I paused. The door was slightly open. Through the crack, I could see him sitting on his bed. The room was still empty, save for the bed and a few random items scattered on the floor. But he was sitting there, staring at nothing. His hand was curled into a tight fist, and I could see his fingers trembling. It was like he was holding on to something, waiting, and then I heard his voice. "Do you think this is the end, Ethan?" he whispered, low and threatening. "You think you've won? No, I'm just getting started. I'm going to take everything back, everything." I don't know why, but his words felt like a promise, a terrible, cold promise. It wasn't a threat of violence, not directly, but I knew that look in his eyes. It was the same look he had when he destroyed everything in the house, the same look that sent shivers down my spine. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jake wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to just accept his punishment. Whatever plan he was cooking up, it was only just beginning. And no one in this house was ready for what was coming next. As I walked away from his door, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had only just begun to spiral. We had no idea what we had unleashed. But I did know one thing. Jake wasn't finished yet. And this time, he wouldn't be playing by the rules anymore. I whispered to myself, this is only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. The atmosphere in the house had changed once again, but this time, it was even more suffocating. It wasn't just Jake's unpredictable rage that haunted us anymore. It was the silence. Jake had stopped screaming. He didn't throw tantrums anymore. He didn't trash the house. He wasn't demanding gifts or acting out in childish ways. He was quiet. Eerily, unsettlingly quiet. And that was what scared me most. Every time I walked through the house, he would be there, standing in the doorway, watching me with that cold, emotionless gaze. He didn't react when I'd ask him something or try to engage him in a conversation. It was like he was calculating something, like he had his eyes on a bigger prize and was waiting for the right moment to strike. And it wasn't just me who noticed. My parents, especially my mom, were increasingly unsettled by it, but they didn't know how to handle it. Then there was the problem of my mom. Lisa couldn't handle seeing Jake like this. She couldn't handle seeing him suffer. Even though Dad was firm on his decision to let Jake face the consequences of his actions, my mom, she couldn't resist the pull. She couldn't stop herself from trying to make it better for Jake. I knew she was secretly buying him things again. It started small. She'd sneak him a Nintendo Switch when Dad wasn't around. Then, when Jake got his hands on the laptop again, I realized she had also caved and let him use it, despite Dad's orders to confiscate it. At first, I thought maybe she was just trying to soften the blow, hoping Jake would find some comfort in these things. But soon, it was clear this wasn't about making amends. It was about giving in to Jake's demands. She was letting him manipulate her. And Jake knew it. He started demanding more. Every day it was something new. A new video game, more time on the laptop, new clothes, anything he could think of. When Lisa couldn't deliver, he'd stare at her with that blank, calculating look and say, "You love me, don't you, Mom?" It was always enough to make her crumble. But then things escalated. Jake began to get violent. One afternoon, when Lisa told him she couldn't buy back everything he'd lost, again, Jake snapped. Without warning, he grabbed the laptop from the coffee table and hurled it to the floor, shattering it into pieces. Lisa froze. And Jake was standing there, expressionless, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You can't give me what I want, can you?" he taunted, his voice dripping with coldness. Lisa tried to stay calm, but when she told him no, that he couldn't just have everything, Jake grabbed her wrist. His grip was tight, almost suffocating. He dug his fingers into her skin, and she cried out in pain as his words sliced through her. "You never really loved me, did you? You always loved Ethan more," Jake hissed, his voice low and venomous. Lisa didn't fight back. She just stood there, frozen, letting him hurt her with every word. I watched in horror as Jake released his grip on her wrist, and Lisa stumbled back, shaking. Her face was pale, the tears already starting to fall. I never thought I'd see my mother like this. She was a shell of the woman she used to be. She was broken. But it didn't stop there. Later that night, something completely snapped in her. Jake had left the room after his outburst, and for a few moments there was silence. Then it shattered when I heard her scream. I ran downstairs to find her in the kitchen, hands gripping her own hair, tugging at it violently. She was crying, no, screaming, as she slapped her own face over and over. I don't even know what she was saying. She was shaking uncontrollably, a wild, frantic look in her eyes, as if she were trying to wake herself from a nightmare she couldn't escape. "Mom, stop!" I shouted, trying to pull her hands away, but she pushed me off, too far gone. I had never seen her this out of control, this broken. Then Dad came home. I'll never forget the look on his face when he walked through that door and saw her. Her face streaked with tears, clutching her hair, staring at herself like she was someone else. He immediately called for an ambulance. But Jake? He didn't say a word, not one. He just sat there in the corner watching us. His eyes weren't filled with pity, not even concern, just coldness. It was like he was observing us as if we were all just a part of some game. As my mom was rushed to the hospital, I stayed behind with Jake. I had to. He was quiet again, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. He hadn't moved an inch since Dad had left. He was sitting in the same spot, staring at his hands. I tried talking to him, asking him what had happened, what had caused all this. I even asked him if he was okay, but his eyes never left his hands. He turned slowly, and finally, in a voice so calm, so void of emotion, he said, "Mom wasn't strong enough." I froze. "Dad isn't either," he added, still looking at his hands. Then, slowly, he looked up at me, his lips curling into a faint, eerie smile. "But don't worry, Ethan. I'll take care of everything." I felt my stomach drop. I knew then that Jake wasn't the same person anymore. He was something else, something far more dangerous. His smile wasn't one of kindness or joy. It was the smile of someone who had already decided what came next. And I wasn't sure I was ready for what that would be. It wasn't just the family that was broken now. It was something much darker, something that no one could fix. The house was quieter than it had ever been. The echo of chaos, the shattering of glass, the screams, it was all gone. But it wasn't peace. It was the stillness before a storm. Dad, he changed. I had never seen him like this. Broken, defeated. I always thought my father was strong, untouchable. But the man who sat in front of me now was a shadow of the one I used to know. He cried, something I had never witnessed before. Sitting on the couch, his face buried in his hands, he looked at me with tears streaming down his face. "I've ruined everything. Ethan," he said, his voice trembling. "I've created a monster. I let it go on for too long." He couldn't even look me in the eyes as he spoke. He was ashamed. "I failed you. I failed your mom. And I failed Jake, too." I had never seen my father like this, so utterly defeated. But I didn't know how to react. He was sorry. But was it enough? Could any amount of regret undo the damage that had been done? Could any apology erase the years of enabling Jake? But as much as he apologized, I couldn't help but wonder, was it already too late? And then there was Jake. He surprised us all. For the past few days, he'd been different. Too different. Almost normal. He cleaned up without being asked, did his chores, didn't argue. He didn't even demand anything. It was like the storm inside him had finally settled. And now, he was just calm. Too calm. I didn't trust it. I remember the last time I saw him before I left the house for the evening. He was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, not even paying attention to the show. When I stood up to leave, he turned to me slowly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "You think I've changed?" he asked, his voice almost soft. "You think I've given up?" I froze. He tilted his head and gave that cold, eerie smile again, the one that made my skin crawl. "I haven't lost," he whispered. "Not even close." I don't know what he meant by that, but it sounded like a promise, or a threat. I left that night with a pit in my stomach, unsure of what to make of his behavior. Was he really turning a new leaf? Or was this all part of his next play? Was this his way of getting us to trust him, only to tear us apart again when we least expected it? That night, Dad woke up in the middle of the night. He didn't know what woke him, but when he opened his eyes, he saw Jake standing at the foot of the bed. He wasn't speaking, just staring at him. His eyes were empty, lifeless, but the smile on his face was cold, calculated. Dad said he didn't know how long Jake had been there, but it felt like an eternity. There was no word spoken, just that cold smile. I didn't know what was happening to my brother anymore, or if he was even my brother anymore. The thing I do know is this. The nightmare isn't over. Jake, he's still out there. And I'm not sure what kind of person he's going to become. I don't know how much longer any of us can keep pretending like we can control this, because the truth is, we never could.